got ourselves a broken arrow.
A broken what?
It's what we call it when we lose a nuclear weapon.
I don't know what's scarier, losing nuclear weapons, but that it happens so often there's actually a term for it.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the series I'm going to be running on the Broken Arrow. And this is going to be an in-depth look at fascinating opening line of the modern defence, which we'll get through in quite a bit of detail. At least that's the plan anyway. So looking at the series, it's a series of videos looking at the Broken Arrow line of the modern defence. I'm going to explain exactly what line we're looking at a little bit later. We're going to be utilising both PowerPoint and ChessBase to present plans, ideas, games and analysis of the opening. And it's going to look at things from both sides, as well as looking at the development of the opening, a bit of the history, as well as current Grandmaster and some of my own games. So the plan for the series at the moment, first episode, the one that you're watching at the moment, is an introduction to the opening, looking at the starting position for our analysis, as well as a bit of a history of the variation. Next episode we're going to get into the key ideas, plans and typical piece placements used by both sides in this opening. Episode 3 we're going to look at Grandmasters who play the variation, as black in particular, and certain key Grandmaster games. Episode 4 we're going to look at a survey of current theory and engine evaluations. This is something that in particular, this tends to be a kind of opening where engines struggle to some extent in terms of evaluating the positions that you find. Episode 5 I'm going to be looking at my own games, both ACF and FIDE rated games, where I've played a few of them in the last sort of 12 months or so using this line, as well as online games. Episode 6 again, more game reviews, looking at my own games, possibly as well with some online games with live commentary, where I'm basically playing, say, a blitz game in the line and basically verbalising my thought process during the game. So you've got an idea of how things work in a practical setting with a limited time period. Episode 7 and beyond is going to be based on viewer feedback. Yes, this means that you need to let me know what you want to see in the videos. So if you want to see more, say, live play blitz games with commentary, I'm happy to do that. If you want to see more kind of analysis of Grandmaster games, again, I'm happy to do that. If you'd rather look back and go through sort of key plans and ideas and that sort of thing, again, I can do that. But I definitely want some feedback from people watching this. For the feedback, send me an email, melbournegamescoach@hotmail.com. So we get to the starting position. The opening, which I guess we're using the term, or I'm using the term here, Broken Arrow, which comes from Charlie Story's book, The Sniper, which is where he's basically devised a system where you play basically G6, Bishop G7 and C5 against pretty much anything the white plays. And this line, the Broken Arrow, starts off D4, G6, C4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, C5. Obviously those moves can be transposed, they don't need to happen in that particular order. A game might start off, say, D4, C5, D5, G6, C4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, for example. But the key point is D5 on move 4, Bishop takes C3, check, and obviously to get out of check, white plays B takes C3. The resulting position has a range of important static and dynamic features that we'll look at in a bit more detail in the next episode. This is just a bit of introductory episode to it, but this is our critical starting position. This is where our analysis is going to start from, in obviously later in this episode as well, but also in future episodes, and this is going to be our where we're going to lead off with our looking at ideas and plans and the like. Moving to something of a bit of a history of the variation. It's got, as as it is here, a bit of interesting historical development. I've actually used Megabase 2010 to get these sort of facts and figures. D4G6 first played way back in 1855 in the game Cochrane Mahascandra, which Cochrane won in 46 moves. Moving a bit further down the track, the D4G6, C4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, C5, first played in 1856. Somakarana against Cochrane. So again, we've got Cochrane playing both sides of this opening, albeit that it came about somewhat by transposition. I believe it was C4. It was either D4, C5, and then C4 or C4 first, something along those lines. I can't remember off the top of my head, but again, as I said, it's in Megabase 2010, and I'm sure you can find it in a number of online databases if you really want to look up that game. Again, this was won by Cochrane in 25 moves. A bit further on, the D4 G6, C4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, C5 and D5. First played in 1919 in the game Capablanca Pali. Yes, it's that Capablanca, Jose Raul, the former world chess champion. And Pali actually won it. This was actually from a simultaneous exhibition that Capablanca did in 1919. Pali actually went on to win that in 33 moves. He ended up in a position where he had a queen against a rook and a knight, and was basically using the queen to, or the queen was about to start mopping up the pawns, and Capablanca obviously resigned. Following on from that, we've got a bit of a delay in terms of a gap in history, I suppose, where you've got that same position, but the first time that bishop takes c3 check was played was 1984 in the game Gurevich-Dzindzichashvili, which was drawn in 37 moves, and this is a game that we're going to actually look at in some detail shortly. Before that 1984 game, when Dzindzichashvili actually played bishop takes c3 check for the first time, Black's main fourth move there was playing d6, although f5 and knight f6 had also been played in that position. And finally, after bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, queen a5 was first played in 1993 in the game between Koch and Neuer, which Koch won in 29 moves. But as you can see, the fact that this queen a5 move, and in fact the whole idea of playing bishop takes c3 initially, has only been around since 84, and the queen a5 line around since 93. It's all fairly new, particularly in terms of chess history anyway. So this leads us to a more general question of why play the opening. Being a relatively new variation, as you can see from that sort of quick historical look at things, the line with bishop takes c3 check's only been around since 1984, so it's under 30 years old. So there are a number of points to support playing it. There's a limited theoretical analysis of the opening. There's limited coverage in general opening manuals. So if in particular you've got an opponent that you know isn't sort of familiar with sort of computers using databases, that sort of thing, and tends to rely on the more sort of old-fashioned sort of book style stuff, and has their copy of an MCO or whatever opening manual they choose, they're really unlikely to find much on this opening in there at all, if there's anything on it altogether. Again, because these things are only relatively new, they're sort of unlikely to appear in these kind of general opening manuals. The point being that they're basically so rare, and the fact that the line itself is so new, they're not, publishers aren't really going to commit to putting all this sort of material and analysis into print for something that may hardly ever, or basically almost never get played in practice. In addition to all that, it tends to put the opponents in unfamiliar territory, and particularly so early on in the game. Often you'll get sort of people that will know, be able to belt out sort of 10-15 moves, particularly of some of the older openings. You can get sort of Queen's Gambits and Lopez's and that type of thing, where players are happy to belt out sort of 10-15 moves of theory before they even have to start thinking for themselves. Playing an opening like this, you've got your opponents in unfamiliar territory right from, the very first few moves, and they're having to, essentially improvise right from the get-go. Also, being a fairly new opening, there's plenty of room for original play and ideas. However, having said all that, the next point can also be seen as reasons not to play the opening as well. The fact is that, given that it's only been around for under 30 years, things could come around and the basic ideas and sort of analysis of the opening that has been presented can actually be refuted. So what this does mean is that what you're about to see may become obsolete in the near future. Having said that, hopefully it won't. I don't think computer evaluations will change that drastically, and as well, given this point that I made earlier about plenty of room for original play and ideas, even if one or two ideas do end up getting refuted, again, there's still plenty of ways to play the game of chess without having to reinvent the wheel and throw away the entire opening altogether. That's going to lead us into the first game of this system, which saw Dmitry Gurevich playing white against Gurevich-Dzindzichashvili. The game played in 1984 in the US Championships. Both players are grandmasters at this time, and we'll be back in a sec and we'll have a look at this game. Okay, this is the game we're going to look at, the first in the line that we're going to be looking at, the Broken Arrow, with this series. It also goes by the name of the Jinji Indian, basically after this game. So the game is between Dmitry Gurevich, playing white, with a rating of 2505, Grandmaster at this time, and he's playing Gurevich-Dzindzichashvili, again another Grandmaster, 2520 is his rating, and this is in the first round of the 1984 United States Championship, which was, I believe, a round-robin event. So it starts off in the system that we're going to be looking at: d4, g6, c4, bishop g7, knight c3, c5. Gurevich plays d5, gaining some space, and Dzindzichashvili plays the move that we're going to be looking at: bishop takes c3 check. Pretty obvious recapture from Gurevich, taking back with the b pawn, and this is the starting point for our analysis. Dzindzichashvili in this position played f5. The move immediately starts the battle for control of the e4 square, and this is a key square that we'll see in quite a number of positions in this sort of broken arrow line. Gurevich actually responds very aggressively to a new opening idea and plays g4. He's prepared to sacrifice a pawn to try and speed up his development, fight for control of the e4 square, and potentially hinder black's development, as we'll see with some of the ideas later on. Dzindzichashvili decides to take on Gurevich, takes on g4 with a pawn. The other alternative in this position, instead of taking the pawn, was to play d6, so that obviously if g takes f5, then you can simply recapture with the bishop. But going back to the game, after f takes g4, Gurevich played h3, and this is an idea that's kind of similar in many ways to the Benko Gambit, where white's prepared to give up a pawn for a lead in development and open lines. Obviously, if you take on h3, you're going to recapture with the bishop. This is again going to hinder the development, particularly with what to do with a white squared bishop. You're going to open up kings, obviously, with the rook. You're going to up lines towards the king, with the rook already on an open h file. Potentially white could probably leave the king in the center, and maybe find a way to swing the rook from the a file over to the g file again and attack down that way. However, Dzindzichashvili didn't go down this path, and he played g3, declining the pawn. And the structure that results after pawn takes g3 and the fairly natural d6 is an interesting one. You see that white has obviously the double C pawns on C3 and C4, pawn on D5, and pawn back on E2 for the time being. Black, on the other hand, has the sort of the pawn change from E7 to C5. Pawns all on black squares, and it's the bishop that's been exchanged off. So in theory, the bishop on C8, the white squared bishop, is black's good bishop, given that you've got the pawns on dark squares, at least the pawns in the center anyway. So this is going to be something critical in terms of what we look at in particular next episode, in terms of ideas and themes directed around this pawn structure, and in particular this balance between the three black pawns on the ED and C files up against the doubled C pawns and the pawn on D5 for white. Here Gurevich played Queen A4. This move's kind of designed, I think, to disrupt black's development. The natural square for the knight is D7, but obviously if the knight goes to D7 to block the check, then that's hemming in the C8 bishop. So it's kind of a bit awkward. It also stops the queen coming up to A5 immediately, which is again kind of the natural square for the queen in this position. But as we'll see, black's actually got a fair few resources in this position, and there's no need to sort of happily accept this situation and just play knight D7 and basically have very minimal play. So here black plays bishop D7. Obviously it's attacking the queen, so the queen goes back to B3, and now there's a attack on the B7 pawn. Here black plays Queen A5, ignoring the threat altogether. However, this is actually a really good tactical way to defend the position. Black's happy to allow all the queenside pieces to get exchanged because structurally the pawn formation is going to favour black, and the minor pieces in this position are actually going to be better for black. So if, for example, white decided to take on B7, black can then take on C3, king F2, take on A1, take on A8, take on C1, take on B8, king F7, take on A7. Obviously we're threatening the bishop on D7, so bishop F5. And this position is actually a lot better for black, in spite of the fact that white has an extra pawn. Black's king is very, very safe in that position on F7. And the piece placement's better. The knight is obviously going to go to F6. It's got great targets, a great square if it can get to E4. Obviously, at the moment it gets there with a check as well. There's the immediate threat on the C4 pawn, which white probably wants to do something about. And there's not a lot the white's really got in terms of development. To try and get the pieces untangled, you really have to put the bishop on G2. That makes the C4 pawn hard to defend. If you push the E pawn, then there might be issues on the second rank. Again, you've got the black knight coming into E4 fairly straight. Well, it's a fairly obvious place for the black knight to go, and then the rook can swing to the game, depending on what obviously white does, but maybe on the sort of the B file or something like that, black might be able to play, say, queen to say B2 or something like that, and then follow up with rook B8. And really, the only trumps that white's got in this position are that the queen's in a vaguely threatening position on A7, and there's a passed A pawn. And if those go or are neutralised, then it's basically completely in black's favour. So this Queen A5 idea is actually really, really strong. Gurevich takes the fairly logical response in that sense, in that he just calmly defends on C3 with the bishop by playing D2, bishop to D2. So this renews the threat on the B7 pawn. Black actually just ignores it and plays the amazing, or the amazing looking at least, knight F6. Fritz immediately jumps up and sort of says, you're losing a rook, it's -4, and then as time goes on it sort of slowly modifies its evaluation to realise that what actually happens is that after queen takes B7, castle, and then take taking the rook. Black simply plays queen b6, and the queen's actually trapped on a8. So all black needs to do now is just play bishop c8, bishop b7, and take the queen. And he's won a queen for a rook. A queen for a rook and a bishop. And particularly given the structural weaknesses that are there in the long term with the double c pawns, you'd expect black to win this position fairly convincingly. So after knight f6, the potential threat on the b7 pawn, isn't actually there. So white plays another, I suppose, logical move. Again, trying to fight for the e4 square by playing bishop to g2. But in doing so, that takes away some of the control on c4 that you might have expected after, for example, the pawn going to say e3 or e4 if possible. The bishop on that sort of f1 square, or maybe even going to d3 or something like that, can still control the c4 square that's one of the weaknesses in the position, as well as maybe also controlling, say, the e4 square by, say, playing e3 then bishop d3, and then maybe even in a later e4. So now black decides to just, again, calmly defend the b7 pawn to queen a6. It also provides another attacker on the c4 pawn, and this is another key maneuver that you'll see in this sort of position, this sort of queen a5, queen a6 idea to attack the c pawn. Continuing with that theme, and again another idea with development that you'll see the knight from b8 go via d7 to b6, and that will again help with that pressure on the c4 pawn. Here white plays a4. Dual purposes in that, first of all, it stops the black bishop coming to a4, which would have been fantastic if black could play the bishop to a4 and then play that knight d7 to b6 idea. Then that c4 pawn really is going to fall for not a lot. So bishop f5, again the idea to get that sort of knight d7 maneuver in, so black can complete the development. And obviously on f5 that bishop's also helping to try and fight for that e4 square. White develops knight f3, black plays knight bd7, white plays bishop h6, which is going to stop kingside castling, but black castles queenside. This is again another move that you'll see fairly often in this position. In spite of the semi-open b-file, the black king's normally fairly safe on the queen side, and it's actually a useful defender for the b7 pawn. It seems kind of in a way counterintuitive that you've got the open f-file, so you really want a rook to go to the f-file, and you're thinking that by castling kingside you sort of get the king safe, plus you get the rook to that open file. But on the king side, black's king really isn't so safe, particularly with that black squared bishop being absent. But over on the queen side, it's actually fairly safe, even though there is that sort of semi-open b-file that sort of, at least on the surface, looks like it could be threatening, at least sometime down the track. Here white played another useful move, a5, so that prevents that knight b6 maneuver with the threats against c4. Black makes a bit of an unusual move and plays b6 himself. Obviously this is relying on the fact that the pawn on a5 is pinned, because obviously if a takes b6 then the queen takes the rook on a1. So white can't do anything about it now, but again the logical move by white to castle kingside to protect that rook and get the king to sort of relative safety. It really puts black in some kind of a bit of a predicament in terms of this situation here. Now black's almost forced to play the move that he actually does next, which is playing b takes a5. It is a bit of a double-edged capture. Black would actually like to keep the lines on the queen side closed if at all possible, so as to keep the king safe, but given the position of sort of the rook on a1 and the queen on a6, white was going to be able to open up at least one file anyway. And by the same token though, although there is the open b file, there is no actual entry squares for the white pieces. You've got the queen covering b7, you've got the knight covering b8 and b6, so although it does look a bit scary, for the time being at least, it's not really such a problem. White follows up with knight g5, and black plays knight to b6. So he's finally got this knight b6 manoeuvre in to attack the c4 pawn. He's also cleared the d7 square for the bishop, which might have been a threat now once the knight's on g5. You've obviously got sort of e4 and g4 as potential threats for that f5 bishop. So white plays e4. The bishop drops back to the now vacated d7 square, and white tries to break through in the centre with e5. And this is where black's position seems to be very much hanging on by a thread. Here he plays d takes e5, although Fritz in this position actually prefers knight h5. But it definitely prefers white here. But after d takes e5, white then plays d6, undermining the f6 knight. So obviously e takes d6 is not an option because rook takes f6. And it also weakens black's central pawns. Now, rather than having that wonderful pawn chain that we talked about earlier, with the pawns on e7, d6 and c5, black's now got these really disjointed pawns. You've got doubled A pawns, you've got a C pawn that's now isolated, at least for the time being, double isolated E pawns, although one of them is going to be taken very soon. So really things have changed dramatically in favour of white in terms of the pawn structure here. Black's gone from having that structure we talked about earlier, where there's five pawns. You had the pawns on black squares in the centre, the good white squared bishop. Now, yes, the pawns are still on black squares, but they need to be defended by pieces. They're not sort of protecting one another. They're not in a chain, and it creates a lot more weaknesses in the position for black generally. And we'll see white do quite a bit to try and exploit those in the next few moves. What happens now with this, I guess, crazy sort of pawn structure is that the game turns very, very tactical very quickly, and it really is a bit of a mess for quite a while. The knight goes out to h5, so if white sort of does nothing or just decides to say defend the g3 pawn with say king h2, black actually gets a chance to play e takes d6 and sort of bring some kind of normality back to that pawn structure. White doesn't give him the opportunity, takes on e7, obviously threatening the rook on d8, so rook e8. The knight comes to e4, threatening, amongst other things, knight d6 check, as well as knight takes on c5. Rook takes the pawn on e7. The bishop goes to f8, and now that rook on e7 is really in a big spot of bother. Rook e6 is played. The knight took on c5, forking the king and queen. Black took on c4. Queens were swapped, and then instead of playing knight takes e6, which turns out to be not so bad for black. Knight takes e6, bishop recaptures. Obviously there's the threat to the g3 pawn now, so king h2. And black's extra pawns and the kind of position of the minor pieces provide some compensation for black in this position. So this isn't actually so clear for white. But there is a move that white's got that really rams home the point, and that's bishop b7, which wasn't played in the game. White, I don't know whether White sort of missed this or just preferred the game continuation that we'll look at in a second. But Black really doesn't have a lot of choice here. Obviously there's 3 possible king moves, but if we look at, say, king d8, you've got rook coming to d1. Obviously the huge threat on the not only the bishop on d7 but also the knight on e6, the rook on e6, and it's practically all over for Black from here. Alternatively, if the king goes the other way to b8, White can play bishop d5. Even if White doesn't spot bishop d5, you still have knight d7, king takes b7, knight c5, and then knight takes e6. And again, White's more than happy in this position. And the other alternative is the king coming up to c7, and then White can play rook down to f7. Again, trying to exploit the problem with the bishop on d7. So you've obviously got the double threat, the double attack on the knight and the rook attacking the bishop on d7, as well as knight takes e6 being a pretty serious threat for Black to worry about. So bishop b7, I think, might have, in this position at least, pretty much got the point for Gurevich, and would have put the whole variation of the Gingy Indian, or broken arrow as I'm calling it, something on the back burner. One would suppose it wouldn't have been looked at too seriously, and would have looked like a pretty ugly loss for Black based on what happened. However, here Gurevich didn't play a bad move as such. He did play rook d1, rook a to d1, sorry, which is still a fairly good move, again exploiting that sort of problem of the bishop on d7. But Black gets to play knight to b6 here. Rook f7, again continuing with that pressure on the d7 bishop. And now Black played e4. And amazingly, this e-pawn gives Black quite a bit of counterplay. Bishop f1 was played. So again, now not only are we using that to potentially blockade the e-pawn, but bishop a6 is going to become a pretty real threat soon. But Black finds rook f6. Rook takes, knight takes. Now the bishop on f8 is on. And again, this is where we have a bit of an inaccuracy from Gurevich. Gurevich played bishop e7, which looks, again, fairly natural, but the even stronger bishop g7 seemed to basically lead to a position where White could swap to a winning ending. So a line might continue, say rook e8, bishop takes f6, say e3, and then you swap on d7, bishop a6 check, king c7, and then bishop g5. White's got an extra piece. You can see that the bishops are going to come around and be used to really cut off the king. So the bishop from a6 might come back to e2 and go to g4 or f3. Really can't see a lot for Black in this position. The only kind of vague advantage he's got is the e-pawn, and that's well and truly under control. So this seems like it's another idea that again might have put the opening on the back burner, but instead of the winning, or the winning looking anyway, bishop g7, Gurevich played bishop e7. Having said that, he ends up taking the knight on f6 pretty quickly anyway. Here Dzindzichashvili played rook e8, which also looks like a mistake. Better was to actually play knight f to d5, which seems to save the day for Black. Black's pieces are now kind of vaguely coordinated. White's threats are pretty much well, for the most part at least, neutralised. There's really only that sort of bishop a6 check threat, and then the king can just go to c7, and it's fairly safe there. And black's the one that actually has this kind of counter-attack starting up now. You've got the threat on the c3 pawn. You might be able to get the e4 pawn pushed quickly. It becomes a serious problem. But after rook e8 was played in the game, bishop takes f6, bishop c6, bishop just drops back to g5, knight d5, c4, knight b4, bishop e3 to blockade the pawn, a4. White still seems to be doing pretty comfortably here, although black does have some kind of play. Obviously there's potential for things to go wrong with sort of the a pawn a bit of a threat. Here, bishop e2 seems kind of logical to try and maintain that edge, keep the e pawn blockaded, and maybe put the bishop on the a1 to h8 sort of diagonal, something like bishop d4 and bishop a1 if need be. However, Gurevich, after blockading the pawn, actually moved the bishop again and played bishop c1. This allowed e3 and bishop e2, and here the players agree to draw. On the surface, at least, white stands better. Obviously, he's got the extra bishop for a couple of pawns, but black's definitely improved the position of his pieces. The bishop on c6 is on an excellent diagonal. The rook's behind the passed e pawn. That's always that sort of constant menace for white. The knight on b4 is on a pretty active square. So black's pieces are actually at a point where they're creating problems for white. Combine this with sort of the a pawn and the e pawn that are sort of potential problems. You could argue that black has enough compensation for the bishop deficit. Something else to keep in mind here is that this is move 37. Presumably the time control, given that this was 1984, would have been using analog clocks, and presumably the time control would have been something along the lines of, say, 40 moves in 2 hours or something of that nature. So perhaps both players, or maybe one or both players, were in time trouble, and this was a way to avoid the hassle of some big time scramble where someone can sort of lose a game based on thinking for 1 or 2 seconds too long in obviously a critical type of position. So here the two players have agreed to draw, and the opening has since been coined as the Gingy Indian after Gurevich-Dzindzichashvili, and this is going to be our starting point for the rest of the series. Hopefully you've enjoyed that introduction, a bit of a history lesson on the variation itself, and then a bit of an examination of this first game played in the line, and some of the ideas that sort of crop up that we'll keep examining over the coming episodes. Once again, feedback please, not only about this episode but in particular the series and what you want to see from it. melbournegamescoach@hotmail.com. Thanks once again for watching, and we'll see you next episode.